She deserves this table more than anyone here. The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful enough to silence an entire cafe. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The soft clatter of coffee cups faded, and every pair of eyes turned toward the man who had just spoken. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention, yet somehow he commanded the room without trying. Standing there in a simple navy jacket and worn leather shoes, Daniel Whitmore didn't look like someone who could shift the atmosphere of a place in a single sentence. And yet, in that moment, he had. Just seconds earlier, no one had paid him any attention. He was just another customer sitting alone at a small table near the window, quietly sipping his black coffee. No one noticed the watch on his wrist worth more than most cars in the parking lot, or the calm confidence in the way he carried himself. To everyone else, he was invisible. But now, all eyes were on him, and on the woman standing across from him, frozen in place. Emily Carter hadn't expected any of this. Her cheeks flushed as she tightened her grip on her son's small hand, her mind racing, wishing she could disappear. Just minutes ago, she had walked into the cafe hoping for nothing more than a place to sit for a few minutes, maybe let her 5-year-old rest after a long day. The late afternoon crowd had filled every table, every seat taken, every corner buzzing with people who seemed like they belonged there more than she did. She had hesitated at the door, already feeling out of place in her faded jeans and worn-out sneakers, her hair loosely tied back in a way that spoke more of exhaustion than style. Her son, Noah, tugged gently at her sleeve, his small voice asking if they could sit, if they could get something warm. She had smiled at him, the kind of smile that tried to hide how tired she really was. She had scanned the room, table after table, silently hoping someone might notice her, might offer a seat. But no one did. A few people glanced her way, then quickly looked back down at their phones or conversations, pretending not to see. The unspoken message was clear: there's no space here for you. And then she saw the empty chair, across from a man sitting alone, by the window. For a moment, she hesitated. Everything in her told her not to ask, not to risk the embarrassment of being turned away again. But Noah looked up at her, his eyes hopeful, and that was enough. Taking a small breath, Emily stepped forward, her voice soft and uncertain as she spoke the words that would change everything. And now, somehow, that simple question had led to this moment. An entire room watching, a stranger standing up for her in a way no one ever had before. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, not realizing they were witnessing a moment none of them would forget. The moment did not begin with confidence. It began with hesitation, the kind that builds quietly inside someone who has already been told no too many times in a single day. 15 minutes earlier, Emily Carter had stood just outside the cafe door, her hand resting on the handle as she watched people inside laughing, talking, living lives that felt far removed from her own. The warm glow of the lights inside made the place feel inviting, but something about it also made her feel like she did not belong. She glanced down at Noah, who leaned gently against her side, his small sneakers scuffed from a long day and his energy fading with every passing minute. The digital clock on her phone read 5:42 p.m., and she realized they had not eaten since early afternoon. Just for a few minutes, she whispered to herself, more than to him, as if asking permission from a world that rarely gave it. When she finally stepped inside, the sound of conversations and clinking dishes surrounded her immediately, and for a brief second, she considered turning around and walking out. Every table was full. Every chair was taken. A line had already formed at the counter, and even standing space was starting to disappear. She moved slowly, carefully, scanning each corner of the room, as if a seat might suddenly appear if she looked hard enough. A couple near the center avoided eye contact as she passed, their bodies subtly shifting closer together, as if protecting their space. A group of young professionals laughed loudly at something on a phone screen, barely noticing her presence. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, a strange contradiction that made her chest tighten. Noah tugged gently at her sleeve again. "Mom, can we sit down?" he asked softly, his voice carrying just enough hope to make it harder to say no. Emily forced a small smile and brushed his hair back. "We will find a spot, okay?" she said, though she was not sure she believed it herself. She considered leaving. It would have been easier. No awkward questions, no quiet rejections, no lingering stares. But then she noticed the table by the window. One chair occupied, the other empty. The man sitting there looked calm, focused on nothing in particular, as if the noise around him did not reach him. He was not dressed like the others, not trying to impress anyone, just present. Emily paused again, her thoughts racing. What if he said no? What if he looked at her the way the others had, like she was asking for too much? But Noah shifted his weight, clearly exhausted now, and that small movement pushed her forward. Each step toward the table felt heavier than the last, her heart beating louder in her ears as she approached. She stopped just beside him, her voice barely above a whisper, polite and careful and almost apologetic as she spoke. "Excuse me, would it be okay if we shared this table?" For a brief second, there was no response. The man looked up at her, his expression unreadable, and in that silence, Emily felt the familiar sting of regret creeping in, as if she had already asked for more than she deserved. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but to Emily it felt much longer, stretching into that familiar space where doubt begins to take over and every worst assumption starts to feel true. She immediately wished she could take the question back, wished she had just walked out instead of putting herself in a position to be turned away again. Her fingers tightened slightly around Noah's hand, and she forced herself to prepare for a polite refusal, the kind people give when they do not want to seem rude but still want you gone. Around them, a few nearby customers had already started paying attention, their curiosity subtle but present, like they were waiting to see how this small, uncomfortable moment would unfold. The man at the table, Daniel Whitmore, did not answer right away. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, not in the quick, dismissive way others had, but with a kind of quiet attention that made Emily even more self-aware. His eyes shifted briefly to Noah, noticing the boy's tired posture, the way he leaned slightly into his mother as if he had run out of energy to stand on his own. Then Daniel glanced at the crowded cafe, taking in the full tables, the lack of space, the unspoken tension that had been building around this simple request. Emily misread his silence completely. She felt her face grow warm as she quickly added, "It is completely fine if not, I understand." Her voice softer now, already retreating, already trying to make it easier for him to say no. She took a small step back, ready to turn away before he even responded, because leaving on her own terms felt slightly less painful than being dismissed. But just as she began to shift her weight, Daniel moved. It was not rushed or dramatic, just deliberate. He set his coffee down carefully, then stood up from his chair. The movement caught Emily off guard, and for a split second she assumed she had made him uncomfortable enough to leave. That thought hit her harder than she expected. But then he reached for the empty chair across from him and gently pulled it out. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady, carrying a quiet warmth that cut through the noise of the room. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the seat, "you should sit." Emily blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. The simplicity of his response contrasted so sharply with everything she had expected that it took her a moment to process it. Noah looked up at her, his eyes lighting up just slightly, sensing the shift before she did. Around them, the subtle attention from other customers grew a little stronger, a few people now openly watching, surprised by the man's reaction. But Daniel did not seem to notice or care. He stepped slightly to the side, giving them space, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. There was no hesitation in his gesture, no sign that he felt inconvenienced. If anything, he seemed completely at ease, as though offering that seat had not cost him anything at all. And in that moment, something inside Emily shifted, just enough to make her realize that this interaction was not going to follow the script she had come to expect. Emily hesitated for just a moment longer, as if accepting the offer might somehow break the fragile kindness that had just been extended to her. But then Noah gently tugged her hand again, and that small reminder grounded her in the present. She nodded softly and helped him into the chair first, making sure he was comfortable before slowly sitting down across from Daniel. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying both relief and disbelief, as though she was still catching up to what had just happened. Daniel gave a small nod in return, nothing exaggerated, just an acknowledgement that did not demand attention or gratitude. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The noise of the cafe returned, but it felt slightly different now, like the space around their table had shifted in a way that separated them from the rest of the room. Noah rested his arms on the table, looking around with quiet curiosity, his earlier exhaustion now softened by the simple fact that he could finally sit. Emily adjusted her bag at her feet, suddenly aware of every small detail, from the worn strap to the way her sleeves were slightly wrinkled. She felt out of place, sitting across from a stranger who carried himself with such calm certainty. Daniel, however, seemed completely unaffected by any of it. He picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down, his movements unhurried and natural. "Long day?" he asked, his tone gentle but not intrusive, as if offering her the option to speak without any pressure to explain. Emily let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. "Yes," she admitted, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It has been one of those days." There was a pause, but it was not uncomfortable. Daniel did not rush to fill it, did not offer empty reassurances or force sympathy. Instead, he simply listened, giving her space in a way that felt unfamiliar and unexpectedly comforting. Noah looked up at Daniel for a moment, then at the menu sitting on the table. "Mom," he said softly, "can we get something warm?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight Emily could not ignore. She glanced at the prices on the menu, her eyes moving quickly as she calculated what she could afford without saying it out loud. Daniel noticed the glance, the hesitation that followed, and the quiet way she set the menu back down as if trying to make it seem like she was not that interested. He did not call attention to it, did not make her feel exposed. Instead, he leaned slightly toward Noah with a faint smile. "What sounds good to you?" he asked. Noah hesitated, looking to his mother first, then back at Daniel. "Hot chocolate," he said, almost in a whisper, as if unsure whether he was allowed to want something so simple. Daniel nodded once, as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he stood again, this time without hesitation, reaching into his pocket. "I was about to get another coffee anyway," he said casually. "Let me grab that for you." Emily's eyes widened slightly, instinctively preparing to decline, but something in his tone stopped her. It was not an offer meant to create obligation. It was just offered, and that made it harder to refuse. Emily instinctively opened her mouth to protest, the words already forming in that familiar pattern of polite refusal she had learned over the years, but they stopped before they could fully come out. There was something about the way Daniel spoke that made it difficult to reject the gesture without feeling like she was disrupting something genuine. "You really do not have to," she said softly instead, her voice careful, almost apologetic, as if she was trying to balance gratitude with independence. Daniel simply gave a small, reassuring smile, the kind that did not argue or insist, but quietly settled the moment. "It is no trouble," he replied, his tone even and calm, as though he meant exactly what he said and nothing more. Before Emily could respond again, he turned and made his way toward the counter, blending back into the flow of the cafe as if he had always belonged there. Emily watched him go, a mixture of confusion and cautious relief settling in her chest. She was not used to this kind of interaction, not without strings attached, not without some underlying expectation waiting to reveal itself. She exhaled slowly and looked down at Noah, who was now sitting a little straighter, his earlier fatigue softened by the simple promise of something warm. "Mom," he whispered, leaning slightly closer, "he is nice." Emily managed a faint smile, brushing her hand gently over his shoulder. "Yes," she said quietly, though part of her was still trying to understand why. Around them, the subtle attention from other customers had not completely disappeared. A few people continued to glance in their direction, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to something closer to quiet interest. It was as if the small interaction had disrupted the usual rhythm of the room in a way that people could not fully ignore. Emily became aware of it again, that feeling of being seen, but this time it felt different. Not as heavy, not as sharp. Still unfamiliar, but not entirely uncomfortable. She adjusted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the edge of the table as she looked out the window for a moment, watching cars pass by in the fading light of early evening. For a brief second, she allowed herself to relax, just a little. At the counter, Daniel spoke with the cashier, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried. The barista nodded as he placed the order, and though nothing about the exchange seemed unusual on the surface, there was a subtle shift in the cashier's expression as she looked at him more closely, as if something about him had just registered. Daniel did not react to it. He simply completed the transaction, thanked her, and waited patiently off to the side. Back at the table, Noah swung his feet gently, the small rhythm of it reflecting a quiet excitement he was trying not to show too openly. "Do you think it will have marshmallows?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of hope that made Emily's heart tighten in a different way. "Maybe," she said softly, her smile more genuine this time. "I think it might." And for the first time that day, the weight she had been carrying felt just slightly lighter, not because anything in her life had suddenly changed, but because, for this moment at least, someone had chosen to be kind without asking anything in return. When Daniel returned to the table, he carried a small tray with quiet steadiness, as if even this simple act deserved care. On it sat a cup of black coffee, a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with a soft swirl of melting marshmallows, and a warm sandwich wrapped neatly in paper. The gentle aroma reached the table before he did, and Noah's eyes immediately lit up, the kind of honest excitement only a child could show without hesitation. Daniel set the tray down carefully, placing the hot chocolate in front of Noah first, as if he understood exactly who had been waiting the most. "Be careful, it is still hot," he said calmly. Noah nodded quickly, his small hands wrapping around the cup as if it were something precious. "Thank you," he said, his voice brighter now, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the drink itself. Emily watched the moment unfold, her chest tightening slightly, but not from stress this time. It was something else, something unfamiliar yet deeply human, like a quiet reminder of how much small kindness could matter. "You really did not have to do this," she said again, her voice softer now, less defensive, more sincere. Daniel took his seat across from them, unwrapping the sandwich and sliding it gently toward her. "Sometimes," he replied, "people need a little more than what they ask for." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered just beneath the surface. Emily looked at the sandwich, then back at him, as if trying to understand what kind of person would say something like that without expecting anything in return. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly accepted it. "Thank you," she repeated, this time without resistance. Around them, the cafe continued its rhythm, but there was a subtle shift in attention again. The cashier from earlier glanced over briefly, whispering something to a coworker, her eyes flicking toward Daniel with a hint of recognition that had not been there before. A man seated nearby followed her gaze, studying Daniel more closely now, as if trying to place a familiar face in an unexpected setting. Daniel, however, remained completely unchanged. He took a sip of his coffee, as calm and composed as before, unaffected by the growing awareness around him. "So," he said after a moment, looking at Noah, "what was the best part of your day?" Noah paused, thinking seriously, his small brow furrowing in concentration. "This," he said finally, holding up the cup of hot chocolate with a shy smile. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, not loud, but genuine. Emily smiled too, a real one this time, not forced or careful, but natural, like something inside her had finally relaxed. For the first time in a long while, she was not thinking about what could go wrong next. She was just there, in the moment, sitting at a table she almost never would have approached, sharing space with a stranger who did not feel like one anymore. And somewhere in the background, unnoticed by most but slowly becoming clear to a few, the quiet truth about the man at their table was beginning to surface, building towards something none of them had yet fully realized. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It moved quietly from one person to another, like a ripple that started small but refused to disappear. The cashier who had taken Daniel's order leaned slightly toward her coworker, her voice low but urgent enough to carry curiosity. "I think that is him," she whispered, her eyes flicking back toward the table by the window. The coworker followed her gaze, squinting slightly as if trying to see past the ordinary appearance of the man sitting there. At first, there was hesitation, disbelief even, because nothing about Daniel's presence demanded attention. He did not look like the kind of person people whispered about. But then recognition began to settle in, piece by piece, expression by expression. A man seated a few tables away pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen before pausing, his eyes widening just enough to confirm what he was seeing. He looked back up at Daniel, then at the image on his phone, and then back again, as if needing to check more than once to be certain. Meanwhile, at the table, none of that tension had reached Emily in full yet. She was focused on Noah, watching him carefully sip his hot chocolate, a faint line of melted marshmallow tracing the edge of his smile. It was such a small, simple moment, but it carried a kind of peace she had not felt in a long time. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, as if he was completely unaware of the growing attention around him, or perhaps simply unconcerned by it. "You handled today well," he said to Emily after a quiet pause, his tone thoughtful rather than casual. Emily looked up, surprised by the comment. "I do not know about that," she replied, letting out a soft breath. "Some days just feel like you are trying to keep everything from falling apart." Daniel nodded once, as if he understood more than she expected. "Those are usually the days that matter most," he said. Before Emily could respond, a figure approached their table. It was the same cashier from earlier, her expression now a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Excuse me," she said carefully, addressing Daniel. "I am sorry to interrupt, but are you Daniel Whitmore?" The question landed softly, but its impact spread instantly. Emily's eyes shifted toward Daniel, confusion flickering across her face as she tried to process the name. Daniel paused for a brief moment, then gave a small, almost reluctant nod. There was no pride in it, no performance, just acknowledgement. The cashier's expression changed immediately, her posture straightening as if she suddenly realized the weight of who she was speaking to. "I knew it," she said under her breath, glancing back toward her coworker, who was now openly watching. Around the cafe, the quiet curiosity turned into something more defined. People were no longer pretending not to notice. Conversations softened, attention shifted, and the atmosphere subtly transformed. Emily felt it then, that change in energy, the way the room seemed to lean toward their table. She looked back at Daniel, really seeing him now, trying to connect the calm man sitting across from her with the name that clearly meant something to everyone else. And in that moment, the simplicity of everything that had just happened began to take on a completely different meaning. The air in the cafe shifted in a way that could be felt even by those who did not fully understand why. A quiet tension settling over the room as recognition spread from one table to another. Emily sat still, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as she looked at Daniel with new awareness, trying to reconcile the calm, unassuming man in front of her with the reaction unfolding around them. "I am sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying a trace of uncertainty. "I did not realize," her words trailed off, not because she did not know what to say, but because she suddenly felt like anything she said might sound out of place. Daniel shook his head gently, dismissing the weight of the moment with a simple gesture. "There is nothing to realize," he replied, his tone steady, almost grounding, as if he was trying to bring the moment back to something smaller, something human. But the room did not follow his lead. A man from a nearby table stood up slightly, leaning just enough to get a clearer view, while another person whispered a name under their breath, confirming what others were already beginning to believe. The attention was no longer subtle. It was present, undeniable, pressing in from every direction. Emily felt it now, the shift in how people were looking at their table, not with indifference, but with curiosity, even admiration. And yet, what unsettled her the most was not who Daniel was, but how nothing about him had changed since the moment she asked to share his table. He had not introduced himself, had not hinted at status or importance, had not used his identity to shape the interaction in any way. To him, she had just been a tired mother needing a place to sit. Daniel glanced around briefly, acknowledging the attention for the first time, not with discomfort, but with quiet acceptance. Then he stood up slowly, not to leave, but simply to address the room in a way that felt natural, not performative. His voice was calm, not raised, yet it carried clearly enough that those closest fell silent, and those farther away leaned in just slightly to hear. "It is interesting," he said, his gaze moving across the room, "how a small moment can suddenly feel important when you think you know who someone is." The words settled over the cafe, drawing attention without demanding it. "But a few minutes ago," he continued, "no one here cared who I was. And that is exactly how it should be." There was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, just a quiet truth that was difficult to ignore. He glanced briefly toward Emily and Noah, then back at the room. Kindness does not need a title. It does not need recognition. It should not depend on whether someone is important. The silence that followed was deeper now, not uncomfortable, but reflective, as if everyone present had been gently confronted with something they could not easily dismiss. Emily felt her chest tighten again, but this time it was not from embarrassment or uncertainty. It was something closer to understanding. Daniel sat back down as simply as he had stood up, returning to his seat as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. And yet, the room was no longer the same, because in just a few quiet sentences, he had shifted the focus away from himself and back to something far more meaningful. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if every person in the cafe was quietly rethinking something they had overlooked just minutes earlier, and slowly, almost respectfully, the room began to return to its natural rhythm, but with a softness that had not been there before. Conversations resumed in lower tones, glances lingered a little longer, and the invisible boundaries that had once separated people seemed less rigid now. Emily sat still for a moment, taking it all in, her eyes resting briefly on Daniel before shifting to Noah, who was now finishing the last of his hot chocolate, a small smile still lingering on his face. It was such a simple image, yet it carried more meaning than she could fully put into words. She reached into her bag, instinctively searching for her wallet, her sense of responsibility returning as the moment settled, but before she could take it out, Daniel gently raised his hand, stopping her without saying a word. She looked at him, about to insist, but something in his expression told her that this was not about payment, not about balance, but about something far more human. "You have already given enough," he said quietly, his voice steady and sincere. Emily frowned slightly, not understanding. "I have not given anything," she replied. Daniel shook his head. "You showed up," he said. "You kept going, even when it was hard. That matters more than you think." The words landed softly, but they stayed, settling into a place Emily had kept guarded for a long time. She looked down for a moment, blinking back the sudden emotion that rose unexpectedly, then let out a small breath she did not realize she had been holding for years. Noah looked between them, not fully understanding the conversation, but sensing its importance in the way children often do. After a moment, Emily nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, not just of his words, but of everything that had unfolded since. She walked into the cafe. Outside, the evening light had begun to fade, casting a soft glow through the window beside them. Time had moved forward, but somehow the weight of the day felt lighter than it had just an hour ago. Daniel stood up once more, this time reaching into his pocket and placing a small card on the table, sliding it gently toward Emily. "If you ever need an opportunity, not help, just an opportunity, you can reach out," he said, careful with his words, as if he understood the difference mattered. Emily looked at the card but did not pick it up immediately. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, not as a stranger, not as a name others recognized, but as the person who had simply chosen to be kind when it mattered most. "Thank you," she said again, and this time it carried everything she could not fully express. Daniel gave a small nod, then stepped away from the table, leaving as quietly as he had existed before anyone knew who he was. Emily watched him go, then finally picked up the card, holding it gently in her hand. Around her, the cafe continued as it always had, but something had changed, not just in the room, but within her. And as she helped Noah down from his chair, stepping back out into the evening air, she realized that sometimes it is not the grand moments that stay with us, but the quiet ones, the ones where someone chooses kindness without reason, without recognition, and without expecting anything in return, because those are the moments that remind us we are not as alone as we sometimes feel.